There is a clay tablet housed in the British Museum, not a monument, not a royal relief carved for kings, just baked clay impressed with a reed stylus sometime around 2004 BCE. It documents a collapse, a city of tens of thousands emptied across weeks of famine and siege. A king was led away in chains to Elam and never mentioned again. And a force the scribe could only call an evil wind, something that moved like fire, that silenced everything in its path, that no subsequent military account ever fully explains. The tablet remains. The phrase remains. We can read it. What it cost to write, we cannot read. For roughly a century before its end, the city of Ur had served as the administrative capital of southern Mesopotamia. Ur-Nammu, the king who forged it into an empire around 2112 BCE, had not merely conquered territory. He had systematized it. His scribes produced one of the earliest known legal codes in human history, predating Hammurabi by 3 centuries. His engineers built the great ziggurat of Ur, a step temple platform of bitumen and fired brick whose foundations still stand in southern Iraq today. At its peak, the city may have held as many as 65,000 residents, larger than most contemporary European cities would be for another 2,000 years. I came across the administrative records while researching something else, the architectural proportions of Ur3 temple complexes, trying to resolve a discrepancy in measurement systems before and after the collapse. But the further I dug into the archive, the more I understood that the buildings weren't the real story. The people were. Because what the tablets preserve is not merely the record of a civilization, it is the record of a civilization in the process of failing, documented entry by entry, allocation by allocation, until the entries simply cease. This is precisely what makes the silence so readable. Ur-Nammu's accomplishment wasn't military in the usual sense, it was bureaucratic. Every worker in the Ur3 system received a ration allocation, barley, oil, wool, recorded on clay tablets with fractionally precise quantities. Every field yielded a documented harvest. Every ox, every bolt of fabric, every measure of grain passed through an accounting system so meticulous that modern archaeologists can reconstruct individual supply chains from what survives. The Ur3 Administrative Archive ranks among the largest collections of cuneiform tablets ever recovered. Tens of thousands of documents from a single century of governance, filed in storerooms across the empire, and preserved when those storerooms collapsed and buried them. Ibbi Sin, the fifth and final king of the Ur3 line, rose to power around 2028 BCE, inheriting a system that still functioned, barely. Amorite migrations pressed from the northwest. Trade routes that had carried timber and metals into the treeless southern plain faced increasing disruption. Yet the decisive blow did not come from beyond the empire's walls. It came from within. A man named Ishbi Erra, a military official appointed to secure emergency grain supplies from the northern city of Isin, wrote to Ibbi Sin in a letter recovered and translated by archaeologists. The roads were no longer safe, Ishbi Erra reported. The grain sat in Isin, but moving it required resources the capital could not supply. He asked for authority to hold the supplies temporarily. Ibbi Sin granted it. Ishbi Erra never sent the grain back. He proclaimed himself king of Isin and began absorbing the northern cities once loyal to Ur. He had seized the right moment. He recognized it at once. He took it. The defections followed a pattern that the administrative archive traces backward, not in the records that survive, but in the records that stop. Nippur, the religious heart of Mesopotamia, whose symbolic allegiance was essential to any king claiming legitimacy, transferred its loyalty to Ishbi Erra within a few years. Eshnunna followed. Lagash did as well. Each city that had been woven into the Ur3 supply network began operating independently, severing the routes that fed the capital. Each decision made sense in isolation. Together, they formed a siege that required no army to launch. By Ibbi Sin's final years, the grain allocation texts from Ur had thinned to sporadic entries and then to none. Not a sudden halt, a slow fade, the way an institution registers its own collapse, not in the crisis documents it produces, but in the routine documents it stops producing altogether. The surviving correspondence from Ibbi Sin himself carries a tone his predecessors never used. A letter to a local official describes the enemy advancing deep into the land, cities destroyed, conditions beyond what words can contain. The king of the last Sumerian empire was writing in the idiom of desperation. The scribe who recorded those years was not a single person. He was a professional class, trained from childhood in the Adaba, the tablet house, to press signs into wet clay at the precise angle that distinguished one meaning from another. He had copied legal codes, hymns to Inanna, lists of medicinal plants, and harvest accounts stretching back generations. He understood, in the way such training instills understanding, that the tablet outlasted the event. The institution that trained him had survived drought and political upheaval for a century. It had never prepared him for the possibility that the institution itself might not endure. In those final months, the ziggurat's shadow still fell across the city each morning. The canals still moved, though with less water than before. The storehouses that had once distributed grain to tens of thousands stood with their allocations unfinished, their records thinning towards silence. And somewhere beyond the eastern horizon, from the direction of Elam, something was already moving toward that the administrative vocabulary of the entire UR3 scribal tradition had no existing category to record. Kindattu of Elam did not arrive alone. The coalition that destroyed around 2004 BCE included Elamite forces and allied peoples who had pressed against the edges of Ibbi Sin's kingdom for years, waiting for the moment when contained fewer defenders than the surrounding territory held enemies. When the siege became a breach, the city that had administered grain allocations for 65,000 people, that had maintained astronomical records and legal codes for a century, fell within a span of time the archive does not record, because by then there was no one left to maintain it. What we have instead is the Lament. The Lament for the destruction of the Lament for in the Sumerian, was composed by temple scribes within a generation of the collapse, intended for public performance as a formal document of grief. What it records is not troop movements or siege tactics, but what the city experienced from within, not what happened to it strategically, but what it felt like when it ended. And the language those scribes reached for in the oldest surviving urban lament in recorded history was not the language of invasion. It was the language of weather. The lament records a storm that annihilates the land. It records fire raging and consuming everything. It records darkness, not night, but something imposed, something that arrived over the city as a condition. It records heat. It records weapons in the streets, but alongside them, a force that moved through the city and left silence where tens of thousands had lived. In Lil blew an evil storm, the lament states, and silence lay upon the city. The storehouses were blocked. The waterways were blocked. The people who remained were not described as having fallen to named enemies in named engagements. They were described as having been overtaken by something that moved through the air faster than a response could be organized, something the scribes named but could not explain beyond its effects. Scholars of the Sumerian lament tradition note that this imagery was conventional. Storm, divine abandonment, darkness, consuming heat, these were the established poetic vocabulary for catastrophe in ancient Mesopotamia. When a city fell, its gods were said to have departed. When its people perished, an evil wind was said to have passed. This is the most defensible reading, and it accounts for most of what the lament contains. Reasonable, except for one detail. Thorkild Jacobsen and Noah Kramer, whose foundational translations shaped the field across the 20th century, both noted that the density of destruction imagery in the Urim lament exceeds what appears in comparable texts for other fallen Mesopotamian cities. The combination is unusual. Blocked waterways, blocked food supplies, darkened sky, heat, mass death. The text does not attribute these to visible swords, but to the passage of something through the air, and a silence that descended over the city as an ending. Each element individually fits the established poetic form. Together, they describe something that researchers working outside mainstream Assyriology have found difficult to dismiss as convention alone. The comparisons are uncomfortable. The Mahabharata contains descriptions of weapons that release fire, produce unnatural darkness, cause hair loss among survivors, and poison water sources for years afterward. The destruction of Sodom in Genesis arrives as fire from the sky, consuming heat and instantaneous death among people not in the path of any conventional weapon. In 1908, a small extraterrestrial object detonating at low altitude over Tunguska, Siberia, flattened roughly 2,000 square kilometers of forest, generated a shockwave felt hundreds of kilometers away, set trees ablaze across an area larger than many cities, and left no crater because it detonated in the air before reaching the ground. People 60 kilometers from the center were knocked off their feet. No enemy was visible. The force had moved through the atmosphere. A similar event over a dense urban settlement would produce silence. It would produce heat. It would block waterways with debris. It would kill people who bore no wounds from any named weapon because the force had traveled through the air. For a scribe pressing reed into wet clay in the hours after, the only category available for something that moved through the sky and destroyed everything beneath it was divine wind, an evil storm from Enlil, the god of air and storms, because wind was the only word his language had built for invisible forces that consumed what they touched. That interpretation has never been proven. It has also never been disproven. What happened to Ibbi Sin carries no ambiguity. He was taken captive by the Elamites and transported east into Elam, where he disappears from the historical record entirely. No death date, no account of captivity. He walked out of UR and out of history at the same moment. The city he left behind did not reconstitute its administrative class. The scribal institution that had maintained grain allocations, astronomical records, and legal texts for more than a century did not survive to the other side. Something had passed through UR. The city that remained was not the city that had existed before. The scribe who pressed evil wind into wet clay was not choosing between accuracy and metaphor. He was reaching for the most precise language his training had given him. A language built for recording grain shipments, legal decisions, astronomical cycles, and hymns to Inanna. A language with no technical vocabulary for an event that moved through the air faster than a person could run, that darkened the sky, that left silence where tens of thousands had lived. Evil wind was not evasion. It was the closest his language could come to what had happened. The Sumerian lament tradition operated through inherited conventions, and the scribes who composed the lament for UR worked within a genre they had copied and studied the way they copied everything else their institution required. But the events they recorded had exceeded the form's original scope. What pressed through the convention, the specific clustering of blocked waterways, blocked storehouses, darkened sky, heat, silence, death that arrived before any named enemy had been identified, survived in the text because the text survived. Clay does not burn the way papyrus burns. Clay does not decay the way organic memory decays. The tablet was always more durable than the event it held. The lament for UR was composed within living memory of the collapse. Within a generation of 2004 BCE, scribes who had either witnessed the end of UR3 directly or received their account from those who had, set down in formal Sumerian what the city had experienced and what the gods had permitted to occur. The text was intended for public performance, a communal document of grief, read aloud in whatever institutional form survived the fall. It was not a private record. It was written to be recognized as accurate by an audience that had been present. The language the composers chose was language that audience would have confirmed: an evil wind, a storm that annihilated, fire that consumed, silence where the city had been. Those tablets were buried, not deliberately archived, not hidden in any institution that survived to catalog them, simply buried under 4,000 years of sediment in the floodplain of the Euphrates. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, excavators began working the mounds of southern Iraq and recovering what lay beneath. Leonard Woolley's excavations at UR, conducted jointly by the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania between 1922 and 1934, uncovered the physical remains of what Ibbi Sin had lost. The Great Ziggurat, still partially standing, the Royal Cemetery, thousands of tablets, some still in the rooms where the last scribes had placed them before the end. The human chain from that scribe to us is, by the standards of ancient history, unusually short and unusually intact. The tablet survived, the language is deciphered, the text is searchable. The Lament for UR is published in full translation and transliteration by the Electronic Text Corpus of Sumerian Literature at the University of Oxford. Anyone can read the phrase. The phrase has not moved. The full timeline reads this way. Ur-Nammu builds the empire around 2112 BCE. The ziggurat rises. The law code is written. The grain allocations begin. A century passes. Ibbi Sin inherits a kingdom thinning at its edges. Ishbi Erra takes the grain and declares himself king of Isin. Nippur defects. Eshnunna defects. Lagash defects. The administrative texts thin to intermittency and then to silence. The correspondence from Ibbi Sin grows desperate. Kindattu's forces arrive from Elam. The city falls. Ibbi Sin walks east into captivity and disappears from every surviving record. Something passes through UR. The lament calls it an evil wind. And the city on the other side is not the city that existed before. The scribes composed the lament within a generation. The tablets are pressed, dried, and eventually buried. Woolsey's team finds them in the 1920s. Kramer translates them in the 1940s. The phrase is still in the text. There was a last scribe. There had to have been a man trained from childhood in the Idubba who understood that the tablet outlasted everything, who pressed a reed into wet clay in a city that had already gone quiet and fallen silent around him, and wrote the only words his language had for what he had witnessed and what he could not name with any greater precision. He did not know whether anyone would ever read it. He could not have known the tablet would outlast the city, the empire, the language, and 4,000 years of silence before an archaeologist's brush uncovered it in the southern Iraqi floodplain. He wrote it anyway. Writing was what he knew how to do. The tablet is in the museum. The phrase is still in the text. We can read it today in translation and in the original Sumerian on a screen within seconds from anywhere on Earth. We cannot read what it cost to write it. We cannot read what the hand that pressed it into clay had witnessed in the hours before. The archive is patient. It has been waiting in the same way it has always been waiting, for someone willing to ask what the last witnesses actually recorded instead of deciding in advance what their words should have meant.